Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Partington. It is my great delight and privilege to be here with all of you today. I am the Director of Advanced Transportation and Mobility Commercialization at the University of Michigan and President of Women in Mobility Detroit. Today, we will be covering a very dynamic and emerging topic, which is Messenger Matters, marketing to and educating diverse consumers. As with any market segment, effectively communicating and messaging to diverse consumers requires investment and intentionality. This panel of experts will bring their diverse perspectives to discuss on how expanding e-mobility use and ownership is highly dependent on culturally relevant and well-researched messaging as well as educational campaigns. At this time, it is my delight to introduce to you Sergio Rodriguez, EV driver and enthusiast, Terry Travis, CEO of EV Noir, and Misty Japa from Electrify America. If you would each please share a few sentences about yourself, that would be great.
Misty, we'll start with you.
How did I know you were going to do that, Terry? So hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Misty Japa, and again, I'm the Manager of Corporate Social Responsibility and Diversity and Inclusion at Electrify America. In this role, I'm responsible for our diversity, inclusion, and sustainability strategy, bringing it to life, transforming the culture, and driving employee engagement. So for those who don't know, Electrify America is the largest open ultra-fast charging network in the US for electric vehicles, with a huge focus on educating people about the benefits of driving electric and how easy it is to charge these cars and trucks. So that also includes, like Ann said, lots of huge focus on education and outreach, partnering with community-based organizations and industries like EV Noir is one of our partners that specifically target the underrepresented communities. So that's a little bit about me.
Great.
Thanks, Misty. How about you, Sergio?
So I'm Sergio Rodriguez. I'm an EV enthusiast. I've actually owned quite a few EVs, hybrids. And so I am all about educating and sharing my experiences across the board with all of my electric vehicles. And I've done cross-country, coast-to-coast drives with my electric vehicles. I've done different shows and different events to educate other consumers that are looking for electric vehicles. And I'm just an EV driver.
And we want to hear your live life experiences. So Terry, let's move on to you.
Yeah, well, let me stop by saying Sergio's being quite modest. He's done some things that very few folks in the country have done. A number of cross-country trips in EVs using the Electrify America network and others. But I mean, he's being quite modest. My name is Terry Travis, managing partner of EV Noir. Our areas of focus are e-mobility best practices, as well as e-mobility diversity, equity, inclusion. Just thrilled to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you all so much. And Terry, you can help me pull those stories out of Sergio from those experiences. So why don't we get right into, what are auto manufacturers and others who are selling this concept of e-mobility missing when it comes to addressing diverse communities? And Terry, why don't we have you kick us off?
I would say we're at an inflection point where we've experienced 100 years of habit with fossil fuels, and understanding that the critical piece is understanding that diverse communities are inherently just that diverse. And so if we begin to want to message out to folks, we have to meet them where they are. What we find in our research and data analysis is that still in the country, as surprisingly as this is for those of us who are working in the space, most consumers aren't aware of electric vehicles and or how they work and operate. So we have a knowledge gap there, but then even, more importantly than that, vehicles for many communities are emotional purchases. And so what happens is that a lot of that is predicated on what your neighbor does. So if your neighbor goes out and buys a minivan, more than likely some other folks on that street or in that neighborhood are going to buy a minivan. So what we have to do is create touch points and experiences for folks to be able to normalize this technology, this ecosystem, so that we'll see a wider spread adoption and move into mass market as opposed to early adopters.
Thank you, Terry. So Misty, why don't we head over to you? Terry talked about the knowledge gap. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think Terry made some really good points. I think it can't be a one size fits all approach. And I think that that's kind of where some of the automakers are maybe making some mistakes. Like Terry said, you have to meet these communities where they are on their terms. And, you know, the key to successfully providing EV education and ultimately access to low income underserved communities is understanding what the emotional connection to them is in order for them to make a purchase. So like Terry said, seeing somebody else in the car, but then giving them the education is the big piece that's missing. Like that's the gap, right? Is that we see these cars and we may feel like, oh my God, a Tesla's going to cost me $100,000, or, you know, the ID4 is going to be $34,000. And I don't know if I can afford that, but there's so much education around rebates and incentives and grants that Americans qualify for, but that the educational piece is missing because they're not giving them that knowledge when they walk into the dealership. So I think that's one of the concepts that's missing, and they have to pull that all together in order for us to shift this needle as soon as we need to.
Thank you, Misty. So going back to this point, Sergio, of neighborhoods and communities and being an influencer, and you've done so much in the EV space with your own ownership and community creation and sharing of experiences. Can you expand on what it means to be an influencer and a user in this space?
Absolutely. So a few things like Terry's trying to pull out of me is that, you know, I've driven coast to coast in numerous EVs, and using Electrify America network, the last trip that I made from going from California to Florida in 40 hours, you know, just purely on Electrify America. And I did a cannonball run. This was a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, one of the things that I like to do is I'm posting this and I'm sharing it with my community to let them know that range anxiety, accessing the network is something that is available and is possible to do. A lot of the community folks that I talk to are fearful of, you know, will I be able to go here? Will I be able to return back home? And so explaining to them that, you know, I've been able to do these trips. I mean, one of my cars I got in February that's a full electric already has over 23,000 miles on it. And that's just, you know, back and forth and just running all over the place to different shows and just showing off the car and explaining to them that you can do everything that you can do in a gas vehicle in an electric vehicle.
So if we tie together these concepts of neighborhood influencers, the storytelling that has to occur, the educational components, where do you think the auto manufacturers and the marketing folks, advertising can begin? Where could they start? And even in the educational realm. So Misty, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think having one broad message that is supposed to cover all intended audiences inevitably leaves out those who don't fit the mold of a typical consumer. So, you know, we have to have automakers talk about home charging initiatives, but also remember that some of their customer base might be in a multi-unit dwelling or a building with no garage. So we have to kind of shift from the traditional marketing methods because that message is never going to resonate with these drivers. So finding the necessary channels. For Electrify America, you know, we partner with organizations like EV Noir that they go out and they do these case studies. They go out and they really talk to these drivers to see where is the gap missing. And then we kind of have to figure out what is our approach when we're marketing our product and when we're educating drivers on, like Sergio mentioned, range anxiety. Some people may feel like, oh, I see the free charger down the street. It's going to take me 24 hours to get my car charged up, because they don't know the difference between, you know, what 150 is, what a, you know, all of the kilowatts and those type of acronyms. They scare consumers because they're like, we don't know what that means. Let me just buy a car that I can go to the gas station and put some gas in it, because the educational piece is missing. And then lastly, a lot of the messaging talks about talk specifically about the vehicles. Don't get me wrong, they are cool. They are great to look at. I love to see the new EV models launch when they come out. But we have to talk about it in a holistic way to say, this is also how you charge your car. Here are some incentives that come with your car. This is how you plug in. This is how long it may take you if you use certain networks. So, for me, I feel like that's the missing component that we need to pull together, is that you're not just going to buy a car, you're going to buy an experience, and the experience is going to shift a little bit from what we know as normal. And we have to make this e-mobility space and electric vehicles and charging stations our new normal.
Thank you, Misty. So Terry, coming back to you, and excuse me, I've got a lighting issue here. We're conserving electricity. So could you maybe expand on, you are hearing and convening a community of diverse EV consumers, and what would you like the manufacturers and the marketing and advertising folks to think about to make this more culturally relevant, to make it more real from a personal narrative standpoint? Could you expand on that a bit for us?
Sure. One of the things that I think that we have to begin to think about is that, well, one, it's not just the OEMs or auto manufacturers. So in this ecosystem, it is the auto manufacturers, it's utilities because they're providing the kilowatts that are going to be used to power the car. It is network charging companies like Electrify America and others we're all going to have to come together, and it's going to be an and more situation. One of the things, to go back to your question a minute ago, is that one of the things that we decided to do that was critically important, being a longtime EV driver, one of the things that I saw was I didn't see myself reflected in the communities that I was going to. And so myself and Dr. Francis decided to found a membership organization, EV Hybrid Noir. And that membership organization has members across the country as well as internationally, and it provides that community. So what all of the folks in the ecosystem, the network charging providers, the utilities, and the OEMs can do is really connect with this community, because you have folks driving all different variants of vehicles in all different situations and scenarios. Sergio is a member. He provides a lot of insight to folks who are thinking about driving cross country. We have other folks who are extremely knowledgeable as well. So really connecting with that group, which is, really representative of the voice of diverse EV drivers, as well as Misty mentioned earlier, doing the hard work. So if folks really want to connect with communities, you have to do the research, the data analysis, and the monitoring to really create programs and pilots that are going to connect in a real world way, and not just say, oh, we're going to, take XYZ celebrity, throw them in the vehicle, and think that that's going to resonate with the teacher or the social worker or the retiree or, the millennial. Like, that's not how this ecosystem works. And we found that very quickly. Our team has done quite a bit of research and has compiled the largest repository of data around diverse EV drivers and consumers. And so working with OEMs and utilities and network providers and others, I think, is a really optimal way to really get folks to think about what needs to happen to advance and expand the EV tent.
Thank you, Terry. So Sergio, I think you mentioned in a previous conversation that you have 4 EVs. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
You've done this a few times. You've lived the development process. I'm interested when we talk about utilities, the OEMs, the network providers, and you talked about range anxiety. So if that's a primary sort of consideration or concern for consumers, how do you think that these folks that are out there sort of creating the messaging around this can help consumers and EV users just like you?
I think sharing real life and real world stories from consumers is a key element. If you get folks like myself and other EV drivers that are out there driving and logging these miles on their vehicles, that can put out testimonials and share like what they have done and how they're doing it, it helps people connect and say, you know what, if they can do it, why can't I do it? But as Terry touched on, you have folks that, some manufacturers that are putting celebrities in these cars, and some of us will look at it and say, you know what, if they're in that car, how do I get in that car? Because you know, they have all this money and I don't have this money. So they have a different type of lifestyle, and they can, you know, manage that, opposed to just a regular consumer that goes back and forth to work and uses their vehicle. And so what I think that they need to get in touch with is the actual communities and show them that this is something that you can have. This is something that you can work. You can find networks like Electrify America. You can find all these other networks that are out there and use that vehicle to its full potential and save yourself some money. I mean, I started getting into electric vehicles just because I'm frugal and I didn't want to continue wasting money on maintenance costs and fuel, and I felt like I was just throwing money away.
Thank you, Sergio. So we've talked about a few important and crucial sort of thought starters or strategies considering what can make widespread adoption of clean transportations in diverse communities. And that sort of fall out of what is sort of the typical industry consumer, maybe who's marketed to. How have you seen some of these strategies work? And which ones do you think are the most important ones to focus on right now? To really drive that widespread adoption of clean transportation technology, specifically in diverse communities.
Terry, are you okay if I go first?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think that it kind of bleeds back to partnering with those organizations, right? So here at Electrify America, we partner with several community-based organizations across the country who are doing the on-the-ground work to educate the communities about the benefits of going electric, providing the tools, access to making it a reality. You know, there's often like cars and coffees are a big thing for car enthusiasts, right? So, you know, for the EV space, we have ride and drive. So that's educating people on how to get in the car, how to start the car, how to plug in your charger. What does your app say? Like, what does this mean on your app when it says you have 35%? How many miles really is that? So I think the strategy is creating content that is easily digestible for a consumer. And what we need to do is also redefine what a typical EV consumer is, because I don't think that we're hitting the mark there either in some of the ad campaigns that I have personally seen. So it's just going to go back to the education and access are extremely important. We have to make the information about EVs almost like you're teaching K through 5, because it's such a new space for some people. So when you're looking at information that seems intimidating, it's very hard to wrap your mind around it. So I'm sure Sergio was like, he said, I got into EVs because I wanted to save some money, but savings, you knew you were going to save money when you put in the time and effort to do the research to understand how this is going to be affordable for me. How can I get this car that I saw, you know, a celebrity driving? So I think those strategies alone will help anyone be extremely successful in reaching the intended audience. But you're going to have to tailor those programs and strategies to those specific communities and make it specific to that community to help them be aware of the opportunities, because the opportunities are there. They are there.
Thank you, Misty. And speaking of communities, I think we are represented geographically from quite diverse locations within the states. Is that correct? So I'm in the Metro Detroit area. Sergio, you're...
So I'm in Southeast. I'm currently in Southeast Georgia, but I am from Southern California. So I am back and forth from Southern California to Southeast Georgia.
And I'm with Sergio. I'm wherever I have to be that day. Almost where I am, but yeah.
And I'm in the DC area, so I'm covering the DC, Maryland, Virginia area right now. And I think Terry hit the nail on the head. I'll text Terry, and he's like, "I'm in here today, and I'm in California today, and I'm in Georgia today." So yeah, he is wherever he needs to be for the day. So yeah, I think we're covering it all.
but I do want to go back and to something that you said that was I think critically important as we begin to think about like how we're going to engage diverse communities and diverse consumers. Ride and drives are great. We have to get people engaged with the vehicles. One of the things that we've done and created is a HBCU program. And so where we go to different HBCUs and we are engaging, and this is all volunteer. We have folks that are going out and engaging with students, faculty, community, showcasing their electric vehicles, talking to them about what their experiences are, answering those questions that folks have that they know, they don't want to seem silly, or they don't know who to ask these questions because they aren't seeing very many folks that look like them that are relatable. So taking these vehicles to these campuses. We also have an HSI program engaging Hispanic serving institutions. We're going into communities and taking the vehicles to them in a real world way with real world drivers that can explain to them how this works, what the benefits and what the burdens are. For some folks that live in rural communities or even communities that don't have robust charging infrastructure, it can be, somewhat of a challenge. So we want to be very honest and transparent with communities, as well as looking at how we create these touch points for folks to be able to engage with, EV drivers and answer their questions and all of those things in a real contemporary, real world way. Because if we don't do that, again, when new vehicles come out, if your neighbor gets one, the first thing that you do is go, oh, let me look inside. You put your hand, you run your hand on the dash, you turn up the radio to see how that sounds. And so it's the same thing with EVs. Electric cars are inherently just that, they're cars. And so we have to begin to think about normalization and how we're going to create these touch points in a real world contemporary way with folks that are relatable and not just these ambiguous high level, attempts.
So I'm hearing that you really do an extensive job of going out there with boots on the ground, convening communities, sharing real life stories, and not diluting both the benefits and the challenges of ownership. Is that correct, Terry?
Yeah. Yep.
So Sergio, as an advocate, as an enthusiast of the EV space, can you help us understand this boots on the ground? And maybe you could share a story or two. You've had 4 EVs, or you have 4 EVs today. Tell us about how you connect with your local community.
So my primary communications, which is kind of interesting, has been at charging stations. I go to charging stations. I mean, there's a charging station here in Valdosta, Georgia, which isn't a really big EV community, but pulling up to this local Walmart, plugging in my car to the Electrify America charging station, the amount of folks that will flock over there and ask questions about this vehicle, about, how many miles am I going to get off of this charge? How much is it going to cost me to charge my vehicle here? And just the full understanding of what it's like to own this vehicle. And then also seeing somebody of color in this vehicle, I get a chance to talk to these folks that are just having this little inquiry. And once I explain to them how much this actually costs me, what the benefits of having electric vehicles are, how much they're paying for their car, how much they're paying for maintenance, how much they're out of pocket and being nickeled and dimed for their fuel burning vehicle, you'll see these light bulbs go off sometimes where they're just like, I'm spending more money for this regular car, and I could get an EV, spend less, and have less overhead, and have more money in my pocket at the end of the day, have less maintenance that I have to worry about, and still have a 4-door, still be able to transport family, and still be able to go back and forth to work. So I've gone to many car shows. I went to a car show a couple months ago called Mustangs in Daytona, where it was all V8 Mustangs and supercharged, and I was one of 2 electric Mustangs that were at the event. And it was kind of interesting because I had a lot of folks that had these gas-powered vehicles that kept coming over to ask questions about the electric vehicle. And when you start talking about performance of these vehicles and how they can, absolutely keep up to some of their gas cars, they're just shocked. And letting them get in, sit in it, realizing that it's just a car. There's not like you're gonna get in and there's a whole lot of buttons you got to push and toggle switches and a whole bunch. It's like they actually get to see that this is just another vehicle that is going to save them and is better for the earth and nature as well. So that's my thing. I like to show this vehicle, give people a chance to ride in it, drive in it if they want to. And a lot of my outreach goes into just being at charging stations in some of these communities.
I think I'm hearing what you're saying is that in those spaces where you convene to actually just use your car on a regular basis, you have an opportunity to create advocacy, information, education for others that might have interest. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And honestly, that is the biggest thing for our community, is getting boots on the ground, getting these vehicles into these communities, because you can hear about them, you could see about it on TV all day long, but if you don't see one driving down the street and you have an opportunity to go up to it and check it out, you'll not make that effort to go a little bit further. Having it in your face, and I have somebody that came up to me the other day. I met them about a month and a half ago, that they got a chance to sit in my car, play with it, and they came up to me the other day letting me know that they ordered one and that hopefully they're going to have it in the next 2 months, and they're super excited about it. And it's just funny that a simple conversation at like close to Halloween resulted in them now going to have an electric vehicle, for their first electric vehicle. So it's pretty cool to see that happening.
That's really great. And I think you also illustrated the sustainability of that total ownership, the impact to the environment, the ability to do our part for the next generations. So actually, your comments were also a perfect segue into talking about, what do you think the current marketing strategies do or do not address related to this total cost of ownership over the lifetime of the vehicle, and so how can the OEMs or others who are selling this even maybe potentially as a second use vehicle, how can they support diverse customers and let them know? And I think, Misty, you would touch on some incentives and things like that as well. So just sort of circling around this total cost of ownership as being an important consideration for a diverse consumer of EVs, can we sort of unpack what that could look like, and how can we help others convey this message to diverse communities? Misty, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it goes back to like being with this community from the start to the finish of the purchasing process, and being able to, like Sergio said, get them in the car, let them feel it, see the bells and whistles, and then talk to them about, purchase assistance, talk to them about the incentives and rebates that are available for them, talk to them about the home solutions, because, oftentimes I'm just saying this from my experience, Sergio, is that I feel like, EV drivers buy their car and then they're like, okay, where are charging stations? Where can I find a charging station? But they don't think about the home solutions that also help offset costs in, your home bills. If you look at and do the research, you will see that you can save a lot of money that way as well. And then I would say, to help understand that driving an EV no longer means just driving a top of the line Tesla. There are several companies offering a variety of makes, models that really fit any lifestyle and any price point. So shifting the narrative that things are super expensive. And then as far as advertising approaches, we got to tailor the messages and methods of communication to audiences in diverse communities based on research like companies like EV Noir is doing. We have to make sure we show diversity in our advertising. It's a mandate for the company that I work for. As I said, I'm in full responsibility for diversity and inclusion, and Electrify America is an all-inclusive network, which means that our branding is inclusive, our people are inclusive. And, when as a consumer, if I'm seeing a company put that much effort into their diversity and inclusion strategy, it makes me want to see more about their product and what they're doing. So I would say you have to make sure your campaigns and your marketing messages are authentic and not performative. And I'm not against using celebrities, and I like using real people to show lifestyle storytelling, but I think you probably need a little bit of both, because that they also are influencers. So that would be, my take on your question, Anne. Hope I covered it.
I'll jump in though really quickly. I think that one of the more important things is having a sense of community. When you're talking about any new technology, whether you're talking about IT and computers, or you're talking about outdoor living, we all have communities. And so one of the things, going back to the earlier part of the conversation, as an early adopter EV driver, I did not see myself reflected in ad campaigns, even at chargers. Like now, there's starting to be more diverse folks at chargers, but literally, in the most diverse state in the nation, driving an EV. It's very rare to see Black or Latinx folks driving EVs, and there are tons of EVs on the road. So what happens is that we have to begin to be very intentional, as we were talking about in the conversation right before this with Secretary Granholm. That was exactly why I asked the conversation, or asked the question, what is going to happen from a DOE, DOT, EPA, White House perspective? Like, how we're funding, charging infrastructure, we're funding rebates and tax credits. But the idea is that even before we get to that ownership funnel, we have to start at awareness. And we've done quite a bit of data analysis and research, and I can tell you, in the state with the most EVs on the road, 52% of the folks in the state still have a very difficult time naming an EV. And then the EV that they name is not an EV more times than not. And so the idea is that there's a huge opportunity with this knowledge gap. We really have to accelerate and expand these communities, because those communities, our particular community is turned into something, even it's more like a family. Like, we travel together when we do events, people come in and they volunteer. It's critically important. We just did an event at an HBCU in Austin, Texas, Houston-Tillotson, engaging the students, faculty, and community there. But the idea is that it's critically important to support these communities of drivers that are already out there existing, like Sergio and others, who are also in the room. And just thinking about yesterday's panel, we had 3 EV drivers from around the country talking about what their real world consumer experiences are, who are all members of EV Hybrid Noir. And that creates a community and an opportunity for folks to really connect with them and have those folks go out and be the advocate and the champions, moving forward.
Thank you, Terry. And you touched on a couple of the initiatives that you have at HBCU and other campuses to reach diverse students. Can you expand a little bit on that timeline horizon of how do you also reach current drivers who we want to bring into this EV space? But what about our future drivers? What about those that are coming out of school and will be the people purchasing vehicles or considering what type of transport to use? Can you talk a little bit about that piece of the strategy that you're executing and how, the network providers, the OEMs, et cetera, how can they also participate in that process to really understand and help influence and educate our next generation of drivers?
Yep. So in addition to the HBCU HSI program, we actually, pre-COVID, did a number of STEM-based education programs, K through 12, as well across the country. And, one of the things that I think, opens the opportunity is that if we begin to engage the next generation often and early, they will, we have members, for example, we facilitated a program at a utility in the Southeast, and we brought a number of our members and drivers to actually talk to the utility, facilitate a program on best practices in e-mobility. We had a 16-year-old member who her first vehicle is an EV. And so the idea is that for her, this is the normal way in which she would operate. She doesn't even think about getting a gas vehicle because it just doesn't make sense to her to have to go to the gas station all the time when she can literally plug up in a regular outlet at school while she's in school. The vehicle is charging, and then when she gets ready to go home for the day, she has a full battery charge. The idea is that we need to showcase more examples like that. In addition to that, creating curriculums that also engage teachers in this conversation, because teachers obviously are having these touch points with students and parents as well. But the idea is to provide an opportunity for all members of the community. We have retirees, single moms, cousins, all of these folks, all of the folks who are driving EVs now have touch points with other members of their community. And so the more that we can empower them with resources and materials that they can hand out to those folks as we move through this COVID space and that we're in, folks can begin to do more ride and drives and more real world engagement. That's what's going to turn the table, I think, for a lot of folks. Because once you get into an EV and experience it, you experience the fun, the torque, all of those things, it's hard to go back to a gas vehicle. It just doesn't make sense after that.
I think oh, sorry. I was going to say, and also like Terry, if we think about the LA Auto Show, like this is one of the years that the LA Auto Show has their first EV test track. So you can go and you're test driving an EV, then you're learning about the charging stations. They have a huge focus on e-mobility at the show right now. And those are opportunities for consumers or, you know, people, students to go in for a car show, right? It's like a big car show, and you actually have something there and people there to show you how to get in the car, how to drive it, how to charge it, and then have a separate booth that will be talking about how I can actually get you in the car with the incentives and rebates based on where you live at. So that those type of events are going to be paramount because you need foot traffic, you need things that people want to do. They're going to take their whole families with them. As Terry said, it's a community. So having these events is super important to have people see it in real life, that this is real. This is not something that I just see on a Super Bowl commercial. So that would be my only additional add, is that we have to have more awareness campaigns and events to really drive the utilization and the adoption of going electric.
Thank you, Misty. You know, I think even just in my past at working at 2 OEMs, the ride and drives were always the highlight because you got an opportunity to really hear the consumer's perspective, build the excitement, share how technologies worked. And that was always a really great way to convene with and connect to the consumer and really get their feedback early on as well. So Sergio, coming back to you on this question, you know, what do you see as being really important? You've talked about convening community. You've talked about your experiences of sharing and advocacy at the charging stations. What else do you think that you know, the different entities involved in marketing, advertising, and educating consumers can do to really reach beyond what might be considered the typical consumer?
So kind of like what Terry touched on earlier, you know, you're talking about going through these STEM programs, going through these HBCUs, and Misty talked about the LA Auto Show. And the thing about that is, for some folks in some of these communities, one, to get to the auto show is going to be a challenge, and then two, you have to pay to go to the auto show, and then the expenses while you're there as far as eating, you know, and whatnot. I think like the programs that Terry has set forth and having folks be able to experience this on a free level and with actual owners explaining their real life experiences gives a different experience and opportunity for folks that have interest or didn't even know about them. Is now you're getting an introduction to a product and real life scenarios instead of just commercialized. So I think that, you know, one thing that should continue is absolutely interjecting this into the communities, these diverse communities, because we're not really getting an opportunity. I know when I was growing up, I lived in a very poor community, and the thought of going to the LA Auto Show, that would have been something like Christmas for us, because we didn't have those opportunities. We didn't have the funds to do that. We didn't have the money to travel there. And, you know, the way that Terry has introduced this is it gives an opportunity for us to go to these schools. And as Terry knows, I will volunteer to go whatever show or school he sets forward. I'll drive my car there and let folks drive on it. I met a contractor here where I work, and he's 82 years old, and I let him drive the Tesla that I had at the time. And he was, I mean, the man was in tears because he never thought that he was going to ever drive something of that magnitude or even an electric vehicle, because all his life has always been gas. And to experience the technology and just have something like that, it blew his mind that he was driving something that you just simply plug in and go. My California house had solar, so plugging it in at night at the house in California, it literally was charging. It was costing me $2.80 a day to commute 190 miles round trip for my electric car. I mean, what other car can you travel almost 200 miles for like less than $3? You know, that's the kind of stuff that folks need to know about, and they need to experience it and see it. And I think boots on the ground is super important, and folks need to see these vehicles. They need to touch them. They need to, as Missy said, feel them. They need to see exactly how the infrastructure works, what you do when you're planning trips, and the overall cost and effectiveness of it.
Thank you, Sergio. So I'm seeing a ton of questions come in to the right. So quickly before that, what are sort of the aspects of EVs and electric transportation do you think could be really influential for diverse communities? And maybe you could just each share one thing that might be a what's next for them.
So repeat that again, Ann.
What are the aspects of EVs and electric transportation do you think that could be really important from a selling perspective, the initial piece of that prospecting funnel? What might be one tip that you might offer as a what's next for someone that's just beginning this or looking at exploring this? And then we'll go to some questions.
Sergio, Misty, either one of you.
I think the next step is like understanding that there's several benefits to driving an EV and a variety of incentives, local, state, federal, etc., that really do make these cars affordable and within reach, as well as like local community grants or community programs to help with financing and trade-ins. There are lots of opportunities for this community. We just have to make them aware that these opportunities exist. How far the industry and technology have come. This new generation, I have a daughter who's 21, they're learning that the environment is important and we need to save the earth and we need to go green and we need to do more sustainable things. So they're invested in it, but they have to have the educational piece and understanding the benefits, because they will be the loudest voice. Like you said, I remember I was in college and I was using a map, and then I was printing out my map quests, and now we have GPS. These children, they never had to experience like learning how to read a map or the Dewey Decimal System in the library. So, it's all about normalization. But I would say that definitely the next steps is going to be tapping into this bill that was just passed by the Biden administration and helping our communities understand what that means for you and how you can benefit from switching over from your gas car to an electric vehicle.
Misty, I'm going to sneak in one of the audience questions here because you touched on it, which is rebates and incentives. Where does a consumer even begin to sort of build this total cost of ownership and how that can be relieved a bit, or what types of rebates and incentives out there? Where would you point people to sort of understand and explore where those rebates and incentives lie? Can you give us some general guidance, or maybe if there's a resource you would recommend, etc.?
There are definitely normal.com is a great platform to see incentives. There's also Electric for All. It's powered by Belows. They are able to show you what the tax rebates look like, exactly where your zip code is. And then they have a new tax incentive tool that is an amazing tool where you can put in all of your information and it gives you a report back out on how it can personally impact your build of your car and how much you can afford. And then, I'm just going to say Google. Google has everything. Drop your questions into Google and it's going to take you to so many places, building tools to help consumers understand how they can get into these cars. But yeah, normal.com, electricforall.org, and Google will be the best places to start.
Yeah, I'll also add in there. So we worked on a project as well called Access. If you live in California, Access Clean California, which aggregates rebates and incentives and stacks those so that individuals, one of the issues that we know that is a challenge is that understanding where you go for all of that information. So there's a portal that was built specific to California that streamlines and aggregates that. And then Oregon has a very similar platform as well. There are a few, depending on where you live, there are tools out there to be able to find that. But one of the things that I'll say from our vantage point, we really advocate for rebates at point of sale and incentives as opposed to tax credits, just because we know that there are folks who don't have $7,500 or whatever the tax liability will end up after this bill is passed. We want to make sure and ensure that folks at every different level of socioeconomic have access to this new next gen transportation and mobility, and understanding that, particularly in the pre-owned market, with the exception of the last 6 months, I would say, the pre-owned market provides really affordable access to EVs. You can get a vehicle for $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, which is actually cheaper than in many instances, utilizing mass transit in cities. The idea is that we really want to make sure that folks are accessing this. And then I'll, add one more quick thing. The other side of it that's really important to us as well is creating channels and access to the economic opportunities that come along with this. For us, it's not just about being consumers and having, Black and brown communities be consumers of these vehicles without being the beneficiaries of, as Secretary Granholm mentioned a moment or two ago, by 2030, we're talking about a $23 trillion market. That's a huge transition in capital. So we, are really advocating for the fact that those who have been impacted first and worst by the negative impacts of the current transportation ecosystem also be afforded the opportunities to benefit economically. Because if they're benefiting economically and they're working in a space, of course they're going to drive the vehicles. So we really want to make sure that folks are thinking about this through the lens of not just consumerism, but also creating those pathways to success in vertical markets for career paths in this e-mobility sector.
I agree with Misty. Google was where I went for all of my incentives and rebates. I Googled what rebates are available in California for electric vehicles, and that's where I got all my answers. And that's what I use is Google.
Thank you, Sergio. Are there any lessons learned that you've learned over the life cycle of the vehicle, and perhaps some tips on negotiating the upfront incentives, to Terry's point, to bring that accessibility of the initial purchase, make that process easier?
No, I agree with Terry on that. So the access program that he was talking about, I know that in San Diego, they had that upfront where they were able to give the incentives for folks that were purchasing their vehicle. My last vehicle that I just purchased, Edison had a upfront $1,500 fee that went towards the purchase of the vehicle. CVRP sends you a check after a certain amount of time, depends on where you live. But in San Diego, they were doing the pre-approval for when you were purchasing your car. But I think lessons learned is absolutely learning your incentives, getting them filled out, getting it set up. I think one of the other keys is getting those incentives in a reasonable time. It does create a little bit of a hiccup when you're talking about being able to access those and receive those in communities that are trying to adopt and get out there. 9 months waiting for some of these incentives is a bit of a stretch. And, I've learned that with, referring friends and family and other individuals that I've met, trying to get those incentives. It's one of those things is patience is going to be a key for some of them to get those incentives. And I hope that, Terry and a lot of his movement in what he's doing will help get those streamlined so folks don't have to fill out 4 or 5 different applications to try to get their incentives, and they could just do a simple process, get it all done at the dealership and get everything sent over in claim form or whatever it is. And then that way, you could drive off knowing that you already got everything taken care of and not having to follow up every couple weeks or every couple months to get your incentives and rebates.
Terry, do you want to follow up on that initiative?
No, I think that, all of the things that we said, are absolutely spot on. I was looking at the questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we get to some of those because I think that there are some important questions there as it relates to some of this. There's Andy poses a question about faith-based and nonprofits are keys. And I agree with that. But I also think that we have to be very cognizant that As we think about faith-based institutions and community-based organizations, there are two things that I would add to address this question, Andy. One is that yes, that is correct. Faith-based institutions provide a conduit, but in the reality in which we're living, that reaches a very specific targeted sector, and I think we need a more broad approach. So we can do that and other things. And then as we think about nonprofits or community-based organizations, it's important before we begin to ask them to do things that may be outside of their scope, that we give them the technical capacity to be able to expound on that. If we have an after-school program that's focused on childcare, we don't want to put them in a position to be overburdened and overstretched to say like, hey, now we want you to do this, without giving them the technical capacity and or resources to be able to do this in an effective way.
Thank you, Terry. The next question also, I think, is a great one for this group. Hopefully we'll get to as many as we can with Ricardo. He asked, how can we adapt these recommendations to small businesses? I'm going to add to that shared workspaces. We know that this is one of the fastest growing areas, and we have this hybrid work environment that a lot of us are living through right now. So how can we adapt these recommendations to small businesses and shared workspaces and incentivize the adoption of workplace charging programs? And I don't know, Misty, maybe you could take that one to start.
Well, it's definitely a better question for our strategy team. I will say that we have a solid real estate team who works on this exact topic, like working with small businesses, helping them understand how a charging station could be a benefit to employees. So I'm not the best person to answer this question. I can just tell you that we do have a team of people at Electrify America that specifically focuses on small businesses, dwelling units, and how to incentivize that for those companies' participation.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that question, Sergio or Terry?
I don't have anything.
But Sergio, I think you have workplace charging where at your place of work, right?
Hey, we do have it on the military base, so which is pretty cool. A lot of our bases are implementing that, and I know for myself, like I'm pretty big on making sure that they understand that as electrification continues to grow, that we also need to have those resources. I mean, we have gas stations on every base. Why can't we have charging stations on every base? During my commute back and forth to San Diego when I was out there, I used to just pull up to work, plug in and charge, and in 3.5 hours, I was fully charged and ready to go. So then that way, when it was time to go home, I was good to go. And, just continuing to have those, I mean, as electrification continues to advance, that those charging options are needed. We talked about the college students having that option to plug in their car at the 110 outlet. These are important elements that we need to have. I think it's also cool that around the country, we also have free chargers. I know that I travel to get my hair cut, and my barber has a charging station that's not too far from him. And I could plug up, charge up, and get my hair cut. And by the time I'm done getting my hair cut, I can jump back in a car that's pretty much full, and I could get back home without having a problem. So it's pretty cool to have those resources and options, and we just got to continue building that.
And Sergio, you're also being asked to share your socials, by the way, in the Q&A.
My social.
I think maybe your channels of where you're communicating, maybe Instagram. I'm not quite sure what that question means, but I think that's what they're asking.
Oh, so I'll make sure I share that in the chat.
Thank you. Let's see, there's some other questions here. When will we see signs on the interstate highways letting us know when fast charging stations are, where the next one is? It's a great question.
So I can jump into that a little bit. So one of the things, Representative Clark, who spoke earlier, we worked with her office on the EVs for Underserved Communities Act and with a number of other policymakers on the Hill. One of the things that we have to do is increase signage. Folks, charging infrastructure has to be as ubiquitous as gas stations. Just having come back from COP26, that was one of the topics of conversation that we saw over and over. So partnering with the Norwegian government on a project and presentation, one of the things that they have done, and they have 80% or 85% EV adoption of all new vehicle sales in Norway were electric. One of the things that they really did well was they really made charging infrastructure easily identifiable. Electric vehicles have very specified plates, so you know that there's an electric vehicle and you don't have to think about it. And you know that there's going to be charging infrastructure. In Norway, they basically put charging infrastructure or charging stations about every 35 miles. So it alleviated a lot of range anxiety. They have specialized plates. You get to drive in the HOV lane. You get free parking. All of those things, in addition to having signage that shows you very easily and identifiably where the charging infrastructure is, I think is going to be very key to a behavioral shift for those folks who are not part of the early adopter, but part of the mass majority.
Thank you, Terry. It looks like we're getting a little heads up here that we've got to wrap up. I think at this point, it would be great to have sort of a parting message from each one of you. Sergio, why don't you start?
Of course, my gardener decides to pop up right at this moment.
We'll come back to you. Misty, why don't we start with you? Messenger matters. What do you want people to take away and leave with?
I would say from Electrify America's standpoint, remembering that knowledge is power, right? And it's the one thing that no one in the world can take away from you. So do the homework, get on Google, get on, there's flyer, for all.org, and really spend the time on what your purchase is as a consumer. And that I will leave you guys with that because I could talk forever.
All right, so we've got knowledge is power. Sergio, let's come back to you. We joked about the gardener coming by and it happened.
Right.
What do you want to leave us with?
He should have an electric blower at this point, but I have an electric blower. Like I need to tell him to leave so I can do it myself. But so as far as electrification, I mean, it's growing. We have infrastructure that is, Electrify America is putting up chargers on a weekly basis. The fear of range anxiety, folks need to put that to rest. It's building, it's going. I've done, like I said, a few cross-country trips. I've done it in the Tesla. I've done it in the Ford Mustang Mach-E. I've done trips all over the country. I've done many shows, and I don't hesitate to jump in my car and push, take me here, and have the car map out my charging destinations. It's all about trying it. It's all about talking to real world folks that have electric vehicles and understanding that it is something that you can adopt and use in your everyday life. So it's time. Instead of being fearful and thinking that you can't do it, I've gone full electric and I have zero regrets. You won't see me buy another gas car. If I can absolutely avoid it, I will.
So there, we've heard the real life experience. And Terry, we're going to come back to you to close this out for us. Messenger matters. What are your parting words?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think we have a triple bottom line opportunity. I think we can address, transportation burden that really plagues communities. I want to be very cognizant that there are communities that have issues with just mobility and transportation, particularly some of our essential worker communities and some of our rural communities as well. We also have the opportunity to address public health issues. One of the things that we're seeing, if you just look at the news, what's happening in India, the country is shut down basically because of transportation emissions the last couple of days. And lastly, just thinking about, in addition to workforce and economic opportunities that come along with this transition to an electrified future, there's a huge opportunity to change the vertical trajectory and financial outcomes of communities through this transition. $23 trillion is a lot of money. I don't know when the last time we've seen that type of transfer of wealth. And so if we can create economic opportunities for folks, if we're talking about 500,000 charging stations just from a federal vantage point, not to mention what Electrify America and other charging network companies are putting in the ground, if we can begin to train communities to actually install and maintain that infrastructure, that creates an enormous number of jobs. And those folks will inherently, again, drive electric vehicles. So we have that triple bottom line opportunity. And then we need to really be mindful of the fact that, again, diverse consumers are just that. They're very diverse. And we have to, move away from this one size fits all model and really meet folks where they are and begin to talk to them in a way that helps this transition from the early adopters to mass majority.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Terry, for reminding us that this is all about creating economic opportunity, outreach, education, and accessibility for our diverse EV consumers. It's been wonderful to be here, a privilege, and I hope to see many of these conversations continue. Thank you for sharing your expertise and perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.